Superman is one of the most bizarre film releases I've ever witnessed, and it's not really because of anything in the film itself, but because there are two completely different narratives as to how well this film has actually done. On the one hand, you have people saying that this is the saviour of the superhero genre and DC on film. On the other, you have people saying that there's never been a flop more catastrophic than this, and that they need to bring back Zack Snyder to fix it all. So, we're going to actually be taking a look at how well this film did, comparing it to contemporaries, and trying to come to some kind of conclusion as to how well this film did, what it means for superheroes on film, film in general, and the future of DC. So if you enjoy any of that, feel free to subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated, and let's dive right in. So at time of recording, Superman has hit 555 million worldwide, with 317 million coming from domestic markets, i.e. America, the rest being international. This is pretty good for a Superman movie, actually, and estimates are suggesting that it's going to end up anywhere in between 600 and 670 million by the time everything's all said and done. So yeah, not a bad haul for Superman when you actually look at it just, as a number. But obviously there's more to it than just that. The interesting thing about this film is that it's grossed significantly more domestically than it has internationally, with 317 million in just the States compared to 237 million everywhere else. Now, I've got a couple of theories as to why this is. Number one, general superhero fatigue in international markets. This is something that we can observe through other films that have released in similar timeframes. For example, Fantastic Four First Steps, which obviously is a couple of weeks behind Superman, but has currently made 371 million worldwide, with 170 million of that coming from international markets, as opposed to 201 million domestically. The rest of these examples, I guess, are more even, but like 200 million and 192 million for Thunderbolts. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that superhero movies are generally not as in fashion in international markets as they are in America. But adding on to that, Superman in particular, kind of like with Captain America, is specifically one of the symbols of American superheroes, right? Despite the fact that he hasn't used the phrase truth, justice, and the American way for years, he is still very much intertwined with American culture at a time in which the world is, let's just say, a little bit America'd out, to say it politely. So I'm not particularly surprised that a movie with such a quintessential American hero is underperforming internationally, even if that aspect of the character isn't really prioritized in the film itself. It is something that probably is going to harm its box office, particularly in places like China that aren't exactly particularly, big fans of America at the moment. Obviously, we can see here the top performing markets are mainly the Western European nations, obviously the United Kingdom in first, France, Spain, Germany, Italy, the UAE, Poland, Turkey, etc., etc., etc. So it's mainly the Western European countries that are the other big markets for Superman, and I think that that's likely because a lot of the East just don't really care for Superman particularly, or don't really care for big American heroes like Superman is. I mean, this is also, broadly true. We can look at Captain America as well. His biggest gross was the UK, followed by France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Netherlands. It's almost exactly the same, with most of the gross coming from Western Europe outside the US. So I think that's a big reason, again, same for Fantastic Four as well. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why this film isn't quite performing as well worldwide, is just general anti-American sentiment and Superman being so intrinsically tied to American culture. James Gunn himself has even kind of suggested this as well. Superman is not a known commodity in some places. He is not a big known superhero in some places like Batman is. That affects things, and it also affects things that we have a certain amount of anti-American sentiment around the world right now. It isn't really helping us. So yeah, when James Gunn himself is saying it, I think it's a fair bet that this is quite a big reason why Superman isn't doing as well internationally as perhaps some of these other superheroes are, and why it's performing so much stronger domestically, because, as I said, it's such an American character, and a lot of countries just aren't big fans of America at the moment. That aside though, let's talk about some of the other statistics for this film. Superman is on pace to be the highest grossing superhero film of the year, beating out any Marvel competition for the first time since 2008, with, I believe it was The Dark Knight, was the last time that that's ever happened, with the Fantastic Four set to gross around, I believe, 570 million when all things are said and done. And of course, Captain America with its 415 million gross, Thunderbolts with its 382 million, and it is also set to beat Jurassic World Rebirth's domestic total. Not its worldwide total, because internationally that movie has done a lot better than Superman, but I think that's largely because internationally dinosaurs are just a much broader appeal thing than superheroes are. Everyone loves dinosaurs, that's been the case for years. But even that is kind of underperforming when you compare it to previous Jurassic World films as well, even though, it is still doing very, very well. And this is kind of another thing I want to bring up. The box office is still very much recovering from the post-COVID period. While we have had a couple films hit $1 billion recently, it's taking longer and longer for them to get there. People will point to things like Lilo and Stitch reaching $1 billion, but it took it a very long time for it to actually make it to $1 billion. Other movies that have hit $1 billion since COVID include the likes of Deadpool and Wolverine and Spider-Man No Way Home in terms of direct superhero comparisons. And people will say, oh, well, if Deadpool and Wolverine can hit $1 billion, why can't Superman? And I think it's fairly obvious. The only superhero movies recently that have really hit $1 billion are the big crossover ones. Outside of that, most of them aren't reaching the billions that they used to, It used to be the case that a new Marvel movie would come out, and there was a fairly good chance, regardless of which character it was, that it would hit $1 billion, or at least close to $1 billion. We are not in that environment anymore. We are in a post-COVID environment where box office sales are down, and general enthusiasm for superheroes is lower due to market saturation. So yeah, as you can see here, obviously, in terms of top titles for 2020s, we've got Avatar, Nizar, No Way Home, Inside Out, Top Gun Maverick, Barbie, Super Mario, Deadpool and Wolverine, Moana 2, Lilo and Stitch, and then Jurassic World Dominion, Oppenheimer, Despicable Me 4, Doctor Strange. I believe the only two to actually make $1 billion are Deadpool and Wolverine and Spider-Man No Way Home, with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness getting close, with 955 million, but not quite making it. And again, that also falls into the category of big crossover event movie with all the cameos that were in that film. So it seems as though, unless it's a big crossover film, the chances of a superhero film getting to $1 billion are a lot lower than they used to be. That's not to say it's impossible, but it has to be a very kind of unique special event like Deadpool and Wolverine or Spider-Man No Way Home was. The average superhero movie isn't pushing the needle as much as it was pre-COVID. So we've covered a lot when it comes to this box office performance. We've compared it to films releasing around the same time. We've compared it to films releasing in the 2020s. But I know what all of you have come here for. I know what all of you are gonna be saying in the comments. Well, it hasn't managed to outgross Man of Steel. And this is one of the big kind of debates online with people saying, Man of Steel is better or Superman 2025 is better. And I'm going to try and keep my own opinions on each of these films out of it. Man of Steel did make more money. That's just undeniable. It made 670 million at the worldwide box office with a domestic intake of 291 million and an international intake of 379 million. Now, this is a good result, and I'm not going to take it away from Man of Steel. Man of Steel also did well for a movie release. There's a reason why we got Batman vs Superman 2 years later. It did well. It was quite divisive in terms of critically, but commercially it did well enough, at least when it comes to, its box office number. Obviously, we don't really know, what merchandise sales were like or anything like that. But we can tell that, Man of Steel did do well. However, Man of Steel released into a very different climate for not only cinemas in general. Obviously, the cinema drop-off wasn't quite as big as it is now, but also superheroes in general. This came out in 2013, 1 year after the Avengers, and it also came directly after The Dark Knight Rises, which was also a big trilogy for DC, and, hype for DC stuff, and particularly, kind of that dark, grittier style was very much in at the time as well. So it kind of managed to ride a wave as well, to a certain extent, whereas with Superman, DC has been a bit of a mess for a very long time. There is an element of the brand being somewhat damaged after the last few years of DC products not having great kind of critical or commercial success. So the two films, in terms of a comparison, in my opinion, it's kind of redundant, right? Because they exist in such different climates. And if you want proof of that, Man of Steel released in 2013 with a box office of 670 million. And then if we look at what the highest grossing superhero film was of 2013, it wasn't Man of Steel. It was Iron Man 3 with 1.2 billion worldwide, compared to 2025, where the highest grossing superhero film is on track to be Superman at around 600 million on. You see the difference? There were a lot more people watching these movies in 2013 than in 2025, so comparing these two flat numbers is largely irrelevant because they released in two different climates. It's the equivalent of trying to compare viewing figures on TV to 10 years ago. It just doesn't really make any sense because the climate is so different. And we can see here as well, two films crossed the billion mark in 2013 with Frozen and Iron Man 3. Iron Man 3 being the second highest grossing film of that year. Man of Steel doing very well at number 9. But you'll see even here, Thor the Dark World was not that far behind it, and that was the one that people said was awful. So, while I'm not going to take away the fact that, Man of Steel did do well, one of the top grossing films of that year, relative to the environment in which they came out, Superman is more impressive. As we can see here, Superman is 7th, beating any of the major Marvel movies of this year, and it will likely end up surpassing Mission Impossible and How to Train Your Dragon, which could land it a place in the top 5, which would be a very good result. So, it's all about looking at things comparatively. This is the first time in a very long time where it's very much possible that not a single Marvel movie makes it into the top 5 at the box office, with the exception of 2020, the COVID year. If we look at 2024, we can see that Deadpool and Wolverine was the second highest grossing film of the year, and even Venom: The Last Dance, one of the Sony ones, was 11th. Same goes for 2023, we had Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 being the 4th highest grossing film of the year, and even Across the Spider-Verse reaching number 6, which is actually very nice to see. I love that film. So you get my point. We are generally just in a different climate to where we were in 2013. And I think that all these, battles over, oh, well, this one did better worldwide, or this one did better domestically, are kind of redundant. What matters is, how did they do relative to the environments with which they came out. This also applies to the inflation argument, which I've seen a lot of people love to bring up. Companies don't really care how much a film from 10 years ago made adjusting for inflation. What they care about is how much money it's making now relative to everything else. And relative to everything else, Superman is doing fairly well. Again, I don't think it's set the world on fire. It's not a Barbie or an Inside Out 2 or anything like that, or a Mario movie or whatever. But what it is a fairly solid box office performance at a time in which general superhero fatigue is kicking in, and the world is generally a little bit less receptive to big American blockbusters than they were a few years ago. But what does this all mean for the future of DC, for the future of Superman? Is this enough for DC to keep going? Are Warner Brothers happy with this? Well, if you were to ask some people, they would say that the return of Zack Snyder is inevitable and this is a terrible flop and that Warner Brothers will be incredibly unhappy with this. This does not seem to be the case. Warner Brothers was aiming for around 500 million at the global box office, which it has now passed handsomely. James Gunn is teasing some sort of sequel, and Warner Brothers Discovery boss David Zaslav celebrates DC's win at the box office, saying Superman is just the first step. So it looks like Warner Brothers are relatively happy with the film, and that more films will be coming in this universe. So ultimately, how did Superman do? It did pretty well. Again, didn't do great, didn't do terribly. It did pretty good and enough to justify more of these films. Again, it beat out every Marvel film this year and also beat out Jurassic World domestically. And I'll be honest, I was incredibly surprised to see that. I was expecting Fantastic Four to outpace Superman 2025, largely just because even though Marvel have had a couple of stinkers recently, they generally have a bit of a better reputation with movie-going audiences than DC do outside of Batman. So in the end, I think, all said and done, Superman has done pretty good. There will be more sequels, and anyone saying that it's been an absolute calamitous failure probably does have their own agenda, but equally, people saying that it's like the most successful film ever, are also probably pushing it a little bit. I think this largely goes for other films as well. We've spoken a lot about Fantastic Four, and I haven't actually seen Fantastic Four yet, but that doing around 500 million is also not like a calamitous failure either. Marvel would have certainly wanted more, and I can imagine they probably did want it to beat Superman. I can only assume that's why they put them out around the same time. But the way I've seen people talking about it is basically that if not every one of these films breaks $1 billion, then the whole genre is going to be dead. And I just don't really think that that's true or accurate. You've got to bear in mind as well that there are other aspects when talking about these films in terms of their, monetary value, including how they do on video on demand and, sort of physical media releases, as well as the toys, the merchandise. And superheroes are always pretty good when it comes to that. So yeah, but let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you later.